Daniel had always been the steady one in our family, the kind of person who believed loyalty was a simple equation: show up, tell the truth, keep moving forward. I lived in the quiet shadow of that certainty, observing more than speaking, feeling more than I ever admitted. It was through Daniel that Lucas Reed entered my life, not as a sudden presence, but as a constant one, always nearby, always composed, always just out of reach. Lucas was my brother's closest friend, the person Daniel trusted with spare keys and half-finished conversations. He had a calm confidence that made rooms feel smaller, as if his presence subtly shifted the air. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully, and when he listened, it felt deliberate, almost intimate. I told myself I noticed these things because I was observant, not because I cared. That explanation worked until it didn't. That we spent evenings together without planning to. Daniel would cook, Lucas would lean against the counter, and I would hover near the doorway, pretending to check my phone. Lucas's girlfriend, Claire Bennett, existed mostly as a voice through a screen. Her name would light up his phone, and his expression would tighten in a way that confused me. He answered politely, dutifully, but never warmly. I noticed the pattern long before I understood why it mattered that I wasn't looking for trouble or romance or answers about myself. I was looking for quiet. Yet Lucas had a way of breaking that quiet without raising his voice. When our eyes met, it felt accidental and intentional at the same time. He never crossed a line, not with words or gestures, but the space between us felt charged, as if something unspoken was testing its boundaries. Daniel trusted him completely. That was the problem. I couldn't stop thinking about. One evening, after Daniel left to take a call in the other room, Lucas asked me how I was really doing. The question was casual, but his attention wasn't. I hesitated, searching for a response that wouldn't expose me, and settled for something vague. He nodded, as if that was enough, as if he understood the parts one didn't say. That understanding unsettled me more than curiosity ever could. Later that night, I replayed the moment alone in my room. I told myself it meant nothing, that people asked questions all the time, that I was projecting meaning where none existed. Still, sleep came slowly. I kept seeing Lucas's expression, thoughtful and restrained, as though he was carrying something heavy and didn't know where to set it down. The invitation came a few days later, framed as a practical solution to a simple problem. Lucas mentioned a cabin he had access to, tucked away from the city, quiet and unused. He said he needed to check on it, make sure everything was in order before winter. Daniel was busy with work, and I was between commitments. It made sense, he said, to make a quick trip and get it done. Daniel agreed immediately. He clapped Lucas on the shoulder and told him to drive safely, then turned to me with an encouraging smile. "You could use the break," he said, as if this were a gift, not a complication. I nodded, unsure how to explain the tightness in my chest without sounding dramatic. Lucas and I spoke briefly afterward, standing near the door while Daniel gathered his things. Lucas kept his tone neutral, almost distant, as if we were discussing groceries instead of days alone in isolation. Yet when he met my eyes, something shifted. The moment passed quickly, but it left a mark that I spent the night before the trip convincing myself I was overthinking everything. I told myself this was just a drive, just a cabin, just time. I reminded myself of Claire, of Daniel, of all the reasons to keep my thoughts carefully arranged. Reason felt fragile, though, like it could crack under the wrong kind of pressure. The morning of the trip arrived cold and clear. Lucas pulled up in a quiet car, the engine humming steadily, and greeted me with a nod. We loaded our bags without much conversation. Daniel stood on the porch, giving last-minute advice and joking about bears and bad cell service. Lucas smiled, promised to check in, and then we were on the road. As the city thinned into open stretches of road, the silence between us grew heavier. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it demanded attention. Lucas adjusted the radio and then turned it off again, as if noise would complicate things. I watched the trees blur past the window and tried to slow my thoughts. After a while, Lucas spoke. He said the cabin was peaceful, that the quiet helped him think. He didn't say what he was thinking about, and I didn't ask. Instead, I listened to the road and the rhythm of his voice, noticing how easily he filled the space without dominating it. The farther we drove, the more I felt the weight of the choice I'd made by getting into that car. Nothing had happened, and yet everything felt like it was in motion. I wondered if Lucas felt it too, or if this tension existed only in my head. When the road narrowed and the trees closed in, Lucas slowed the car. He glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, and said we were almost there. I nodded, my hands resting in my lap, my thoughts carefully restrained. As the cabin came into view through the trees, simple and isolated, I realized that whatever I was pretending this trip was about, it wasn't just maintenance or fresh air. I had agreed to something I didn't fully understand, and the quiet waiting ahead of us felt less like rest and more like a test. The car rolled to a stop, and for a moment neither of us moved. The cabin was quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet that pressed inward rather than offering relief. Lucas unlocked the door and stepped aside to let me enter first, a small gesture that felt heavier than it should have. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and cold mornings. Everything was functional and sparse, as if the place existed only to serve a purpose and then be forgotten. Lucas set our bags down and moved through the rooms with practiced familiarity. I followed, noting how confidently he navigated the space, how naturally he belonged there. It struck me that this cabin was an extension of him, contained, orderly, removed from the expectations that shaped his life elsewhere. The thought unsettled me because I sensed why he might have wanted me there to see it. That we spent the first hour doing what we had come to do, checking windows, running water, making sure the heater worked. The tasks were simple, almost mundane, yet the tension between us made them feel deliberate. When our hands brushed while reaching for the same switch, Lucas withdrew quickly, his jaw tightening as if he'd nearly said something he couldn't afford to voice. By midday, the work was finished. Lucas brewed coffee on the small stove, and we sat across from each other at the narrow table. The space between us felt carefully measured. He spoke about the drive, about the weather, about nothing that mattered. I responded in kind, aware of how easily we could keep pretending this was ordinary. It didn't last. Lucas stared into his cup for a long moment before speaking again. He told me he rarely came to the cabin anymore, that life had grown louder and more complicated. He didn't mention Claire by name, but her presence hovered in every pause. I listened without interrupting, sensing that this confession was less about explanation and more about release. I admitted that I often felt invisible next to Daniel, that I struggled to define myself outside of being someone's younger brother. The honesty surprised me, even as it settled between us like a fragile truce. Lucas met my gaze, his expression softening, and for a moment the room felt smaller, warmer, more dangerous. When his phone buzzed on the table, the sound cut through the moment sharply. Claire's name lit up the screen. Lucas didn't answer it right away. He stared at the phone, then turned it face down with a sigh that carried more weight than any argument. I felt a surge of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, because I understood what that gesture meant. I shouldn't be here, I said quietly, unsure whether I was talking about the cabin or the situation unfolding between us. Lucas looked at me then, really looked at me, and shook his head. He said nothing, but his silence felt like a choice. He stood and moved to the window, resting his hand against the glass as if grounding himself. Outside, the trees swayed gently, indifferent to the moral complexity unfolding inside that we didn't touch. We didn't need to. The intimacy between us existed in the space we refused to close, in the restraint that both exposed and protected us. It was an emotional crossing, subtle but unmistakable, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. As the afternoon faded into evening, the temperature dropped. Lucas lit the heater, and the cabin filled with a low hum that mirrored the tension between us. We spoke less, each word feeling carefully chosen. When he mentioned Daniel, his voice shifted, thick with guilt and loyalty. That was when I understood that whatever this was, it couldn't exist without consequence. My phone rang shortly after, Daniel's name flashing across the screen. I answered, forcing steadiness into my voice as he asked about the trip. I told him everything was fine, that the cabin was in good shape, that we'd be back soon. The lie tasted bitter, even though it was incomplete rather than false. After the call ended, Lucas apologized. He didn't specify for what, and I didn't ask. Apologies felt inadequate in a space where nothing tangible had happened and yet everything had changed. The realization left me hollow and restless that I packed my bag sooner than planned, the decision forming quietly but firmly. Lucas watched without protest, his expression unreadable. When I told him I needed to leave, he nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. He offered to drive me back in the morning, his voice steady but distant. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees, replaying every look in silence. I knew I would leave the cabin with answers I hadn't wanted and questions I couldn't ignore. Whatever waited beyond this place, truth, confrontation, or regret, it was already in motion. As dawn crept through the windows, pale and insistent, I realized that the real test hadn't been coming to the cabin at all. It would begin when we returned to the lives we had quietly disrupted, carrying secrets that refused to stay buried.